Thank you, Ryan, for the generous introduction. Thank you to Harvey and Camilla and the team for hosting tonight. And thanks to everyone for coming out and providing a space for us to share some stories. My name is Michael Leckie, and my architecture practice, Leckie Studio, is a medium-sized practice, 20 to 24 people, based here in Vancouver. And really, I've built the studio as a vehicle for creative entrepreneurship, meaning that it acts as an incubator for research and for experimentation, for exploration, and ultimately, we endeavor to take some of those ideas out to the market and launch them as independent ventures. Here's a cross-section of some of our recent work, including custom single-family homes, multifamily residential towers, institutional work, specialty manufacturing facilities, and cultural projects. We spend a considerable amount of time working with mass timber and engineered wood products, and I spend a lot of time talking to large groups about the work. However, today I'll share a much more personal story, a story about my connection to the landscape, to the forest specifically, the place where the timber that we use in our project comes from, and how my connection to that is related to my first significant job in architecture. So here's where we'll start. This is me at age 4. And if you'd asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up, I would have said an artist or an inventor. And in my household, none of those things were real jobs. So someone eventually told me what an architect did, and immediately I was like, that's what I want to be. However, it was a long and circuitous route to get to architecture, including an undergraduate degree in biology and genetics, years of international competition in squash, of all obscure sports, and what was ultimately 10 years working in the forest industry in silviculture and reforestation. These experiences I've had along the way have been instrumental in informing the work that I do and the work of my practice and the person that I'm becoming. And I use that word becoming because I really do believe that life is a continuing series of experiments, that we're in a continual process of learning, growing, and evolving. No idea what I'm doing, but fuck it. I love this book. If there are any of my clients in the room, don't leave. Just please give me 5 minutes. Oh, there's one, there's some. Just wait. Let me explain. I love this book for so many reasons. It's a poetry book by Ron Lim. And I recently gave this book to my daughter, Nova, who just finished her first year of university at McGill. And Nova, I'm so very proud of you. You're working so hard, you're doing so well. And this is a really uncertain time and tough time, I think, for young people. What I find liberating about the title of this book and what I love about it is that it gives us permission to not feel like we have to have everything figured out. There's a lot of talk these days about imposter syndrome, the notion that we each might doubt our skills and capacities, and really at a deeper level, our worthiness to be doing what we're doing. So if we understand life and work on a spectrum, and at this end we have comfortable and familiar, and at this end we have uncomfortable and uncharted, for better or worse, I'm always striving to live over here, both personally and with the work that I'm doing in my studio. And we endeavor to exist at the far end of the uncharted and the uncomfortable. And obviously, as an architect, I'm dealing with a tremendous amount of trust and responsibility, and just, to our clients, the stakeholders, and of course, the general public. And so I'm not suggesting any form of professional recklessness, but I will, however, suggest that in order to create anything remotely remarkable, you absolutely have to step outside of your comfort zone. So in order to run an ambitious design studio, you need to get comfortable, learn to get comfortable with the feeling of being uncomfortable, which I recognize is a bit of a paradox at first glance. But if you don't do this, you'll just repeat what you've already done. And admittedly, that's a great business model. It's much better than my business model of reinventing the wheel every single time. But the problem is it leads to generic and ultimately really boring architecture. And what we're striving to create with my studio is something specific. We're looking for the unique opportunity that exists in every project or set of opportunities. And we hunt for that opportunity at the confluence of the clients, their aspiration, the budget, of course, the context, and the site. And the budget, you would think the bigger the budget, the more opportunity there is, but that's actually rarely the case. In fact, it's usually the opposite. The smaller budget promotes a kind of tighter constraint and greater innovation. So the period of my life that I'm going to share includes several years of living entirely nomadically with no fixed address. And it all started in the summer I turned 18 when I took this job as a tree planter. And it kind of felt like a Canadian rite of passage at the time for many university kids. I started out in Northern Ontario. We were living in tents. They'd pile us into school buses and take us out to the cut blocks. And the average tree planter would ram a shovel into the ground several hundred times an hour, bend over several thousand times a day, and carry several thousand pounds of trees and walk over 10 miles a day. And at the time, we were getting paid 6.5 cents a tree, and we loved it. So it was an incredible experience. Long hours, extremely hard work, amazing camaraderie, and millions of black flies. We would duct tape our hands because there were no gloves that would avoid getting shredded, sticking your hands in the ground thousands of times a day. And we slept well at night, not just from the sheer exhaustion of the task, but from knowing that we'd done something meaningful that day, that each of us had actually planted a small forest. Fast forward 10 years, and that summer job had become a full lifestyle. I was spending most of my time on Vancouver Island, the major leagues of forestry, if you will, and instead of old school buses, we used boats and helicopters, and instead of living in tents, we lived in divey motels, vans, logging camps, and floating barges. This is a photo by T.J. Watt of the Ancient Forest Alliance documenting the destruction of an old-growth forest on Vancouver Island, and that's T.J. right there. I believe in supporting sustainable forest management practices, and the studio supports TJ and his work at the Ancient Forest Alliance through charitable donations every year. These aren't photos of me, but they're taken by fellow planters in the landscapes we worked in. And after 2 years of planting, I was promoted to crew boss, and from there to supervisor. I planted about 500,000 trees, a little more than that, myself, and then I managed crews and supervised the planting of several million more. All of this with essentially zero formal training for any of these tasks. We just learned in the field. It felt like a wild and kind of lawless environment. And when I started managing projects in my early 20s, it would typically go like this. We'd have a contract to plant 1 million or 1.5 million trees. We'd have 25 university kids. We'd have a couple beater trucks, a chainsaw, some maps, and an old school bus. And we'd drive to a pullout in a logging road, an abandoned gravel pit, and we'd set up camp there. We'd pull in a cook trailer, and the trees would arrive every week, rain or shine, and they had a very limited shelf life. And we had to mobilize these planters amongst the black flies, amongst the giardia, the food poisoning, the bad attitudes, the mutiny, and somehow coax them to get on this bus every day and drive them out in these terrible conditions and put the trees in the ground. But we just figured it all out. And later on Vancouver Island, it was much the same, but the stakes were higher. The cut blocks were steeper, often approaching 45 degrees. We were burning helicopter fuel at $3,000 an hour, using helicopters to move people and trees, replanting mountainsides, cut blocks that had been heli-logged. We even had the opportunity to work in the Carmana Valley, ground zero for the heroic 1993 environmental protests that became known as the War in the Woods. During this time, I had no fixed address. Van life, as it's now called, was really a thing. It was seasonal work, but when you included all the other aspects of the industry that I got involved in, chainsaw spacing, creek clearing, slash burning, the work season went from October until March, or I should say March until October. The off seasons were for big adventures. A winter at Panorama, snowboarding, exploring the backcountry, a winter down in Baja, surfing, living on the beach in the van. And this is a newer version of the van that I had converted, but you get the idea. That's the landscape. Between contracts in the tree planting season, I would be drawn to Tofino, and I would spend time there. And this is an overview of the beautiful landscape that is Tofino. If you can see the tiny red dot in the upper right quadrant there, that's where my house is. And I was fortunate enough to buy a house there during the pandemic. And the interesting thing is that house is about 100 yards from where I used to park my van off the side of the road and sleep in it when I wasn't working. So after 8 years of what had already felt like a lifelong career in reforestation and silviculture, I finally circled back to architecture. I studied architecture at the UBC School of Architecture, and I started in 1999 at 26 years old. And I was fortunate enough to study under Patricia Patkow. And for me, this was an amazing opportunity because the Patkows were and are a prolific design practice and a big part of the reason why I went to the school. I took Patricia's studio in second year. It was the second semester of second year, and she was teaching a studio where we were designing the Seattle Public Library at the same time that OMA was actually doing that project in real time. I was still early on in my career, and I was so far over my head in this. The site was complex, the program was huge, it was complex. Patricia was a taskmaster, and in the end, I thought I had a pretty reasonable project. We presented it in front of a jury of guest critics, and it was fairly well received. Well, Patricia ended up giving me the worst mark in my entire architecture school transcript in that course. And I was devastated. I went up to her after and I said, Patricia, can we talk about this? I thought my project was competent, at least. And she just looked at me and didn't flinch and said, Michael, I think you've got a lot of potential to be an architect, maybe even a great architect, but you have to get over your hesitancy to make built form. That's what the job is all about. End of conversation. There was nothing else to be said. So I was really discouraged, and I left, and it was now summer, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go back and do what I know how to do. And of course, I went up to Alert Bay, and I went back to run a silviculture contract, a tree planting contract. Well, oddly enough, the phone rang about a week later, and it was Patricia, or actually it was probably someone from her office, and they said, hey, would you like to come in and talk to us about a job that we've got in the studio? It was like a complete mindfuck. I was just like, what? So here I was. I wrapped up that planting contract. I got in my van. I drove all the way down from Alert Bay. I went across on the ferry, and I showed up at the office, and it was a Friday. And this is the only office picture of Patkows that I could find on the internet, and it's actually a much calmer place than this, but that's what it looked like. And I sat down with John Patkow, and he said, okay, I've just built this new office, and it was beautiful, and I've got all kinds of equipment here. I just built this new server, and I actually want someone to run the server. Oh, and also, we could teach you architecture at the same time. And I was like, okay. And so he was like, great, I'll see you on Monday. And so I left, and I walked outside of the office, and I remember so clearly I was walking back to my apartment because I wasn't living in my van anymore at that time. And I was like, this is amazing. I just got offered my dream job. And then as I was walking, it dawned on me, it was terrible. I was like, I have absolutely no idea how to run a server. Like, what the fuck? What the hell am I gonna do? And then of course I was like, well, I've been figuring stuff out for 8 years. And I went straight to Chapters, and I remember this so clearly. I bought Windows Server for Dummies. It was about 3 inches thick, and I spent the next 2 days crushing through it. Then I bought another book, and I read through that, and I showed up on Monday and just started running the server. And I loved working there so much. It was fantastic, and for a number of reasons. But for me, I had been told my whole life that I was too fussy, too detail-oriented, and all the stuff that I was interested in doing, resolving, focusing on, people were like, that doesn't matter. Why are you spending your time doing that? Nobody's gonna notice, nobody cares. And so on the one hand, here I was in a practice that had a relentless pursuit of rigor, and I was like, these are my people. This is fantastic. And then on the other hand, of course, I felt totally at home because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So I was fortunate. I ended up working there for the summer, and I loved it so much that I actually took an absence of leave from architecture school, and I worked there full time. And then I eventually went back to school, and I got my degree and found my way back to the office, and I worked for 5 years on this project, the BD Biodiversity Research Center. And it was such an amazing opportunity for me, and I learned so much. And in the vein of thanking your mentors, I really can't say enough good things about my time there. So here's what I'll say. To be an entrepreneur, I'd say it takes equal parts nerd and cowboy. I'm prone to nerdiness. It's in my nature. And 8 years of post-secondary education really honed that capacity in me. But all those years that I spent tree planting brought out the cowboy in me. And I would say this combination of nerd and cowboy also works really well for the field of architecture. And the other thing that I'll say, whoa, sorry. The other thing that I'll say is, and this is for you, Nova, and to anyone else here who's contemplating something big or new or different, or is already deep into something that they're struggling with, feeling imposter syndrome, is that you don't need to have all the answers. You just need to start. And start before you feel ready. And then just keep going. Put one foot in front of the other. Plant one tree at a time. And then before you know it, you'll look up and you'll realize that you've planted an entire forest. And still today, I have no idea what I'm doing, but fuck it.